They mocked a silent old man, until Hell's Angel rolled up his sleeve. The sun came up slow over Millbrook Falls that morning, spreading pink light across the rooftops and the old water tower on the edge of town. Frost still clung to the grass in shady patches, but the air held that soft, forgiving warmth of early autumn, the kind of morning that made most folks smile without knowing why. The Sunrise Diner sat on the corner of Main and Fifth, its windows glowing yellow against the gray dawn. Inside, the griddle hissed and popped. Bacon grease crackled in the pan. The smell of fresh coffee drifted out the propped front door, mixing with the cool morning air. Margaret Sullivan stood behind the counter, wiping down the same spot she'd wiped 100 times already, more out of habit than need. She was a solid woman in her 60s, silver streaks running through her dark hair, reading glasses pushed up on her head. She'd owned the diner for almost 20 years, ever since her husband passed, and she ran it the way she ran her life. Steady, honest, no fuss. In the back booth, 2 young waitresses giggled over something on a phone screen. Near the register, Tyler Brennan leaned against the counter, tying his apron with the lazy confidence of a 20-year-old who thought he had the whole world figured out. His hair was gelled up in front, and he wore his polo shirt a size too tight, like he wanted everyone to notice. Before you continue listening, please let me know where in the world are you watching from today. Now back to the story. The bell above the door jingled at exactly 7 o'clock. Tyler didn't even need to look up. He knew who it was. "Coma Grandpa's here," he muttered to the busboy beside him, not bothering to lower his voice much. The busboy snickered and ducked his head to hide it. Walter Higgins shuffled through the door, moving slow and careful, like each step cost him something. He wore his brown jacket buttoned all the way to his chin, same as he did every day, rain or shine, cold or warm. It didn't matter that the morning was mild. That jacket never came off, and nobody in town could remember the last time they'd seen him without it. His hair was thin and white, combed back neatly, and his hands, spotted with age, trembled slightly as he reached for the door to steady himself. He didn't look at anyone. He never did. His pale blue eyes stayed fixed somewhere ahead, somewhere past the diner, past the town, past whatever anyone else could see. He moved toward his booth by the window, the same one he'd claimed every single morning for longer than most of the staff had been alive. Nobody remembered exactly when he'd started coming. It felt like he'd always been there, a fixture as permanent as the cracked linoleum floor or the bell above the door. Margaret watched him go, the way she always did, with something soft behind her eyes that she never quite let show on her face. She'd tried talking to him once, years back, asked him how his day was going. He'd just nodded and looked away, and she'd learned not to push. Walter lowered himself into the booth with a small grunt, his joints stiff from age and the cold that always seemed to live in his bones no matter the season. He folded his hands on the table in front of him, the same way he always did, and turned his face toward the window. Outside, the street was waking up. A dog trotted past, dragging its owner along. A delivery truck rumbled by, engine grinding low. None of it seemed to touch him. His eyes moved over it all without really seeing it, like a man watching a movie he'd already seen 100 times. One of the young waitresses approached his table, pad in hand, chewing her gum without much enthusiasm. "What can I get you?" she asked, though she already knew the answer. Everybody did. Walter's lips moved, but barely. "Coffee, black, toast, dry." His voice came out low and rough, like it hadn't been used in days, though it was only breakfast time. The waitress scribbled it down without looking at him and walked off toward the kitchen. Walter turned back to the window. The diner buzzed around him, forks clinking, voices rising and falling, laughter drifting from the corner booth. None of it reached him. He sat there, silent and still, invisible to everyone in the room. Brianna came around the counter with the coffee pot, and Tyler followed close behind her, both of them whispering something that made her press her lips together to keep from laughing out loud. Margaret caught only pieces of it. Something about Walter's jacket. Something about him being older than the diner itself. "Stop it," Brianna hissed. But she was smiling when she said it. Margaret set down her rag. She didn't like the look on Tyler's face. She'd seen it before, that smirk he got when he thought nobody important was watching. Brianna reached Walter's booth and tipped the coffee pot without slowing down, without really looking at the cup at all. The coffee splashed over the rim, spreading across the table in a thin black puddle that crept toward the edge and dripped onto the seat beside him. Some of it caught the cuff of his brown jacket, soaking in dark and wet. Walter didn't flinch. He just sat there, and it was that stillness, that complete lack of reaction, that made it worse somehow. Like he expected it. Like he'd stopped expecting anything else a long time ago. "Oops," Brianna said, not sounding sorry at all. She glanced back at Tyler, who was grinning behind the counter, and she had to turn away fast to keep from bursting out laughing. Margaret felt her jaw tighten. She almost said something, almost walked over there and grabbed the towel from Brianna's apron herself and wiped up the mess and told both of them to knock it off. But something held her back. Some old tiredness that came from having the same fight so many times before with young staff who never lasted more than a season anyway. She told herself she'd talk to them later. She always told herself that. Walter reached for a napkin from the dispenser, slow and careful, and dabbed at the puddle himself. His hand shook doing it, the same tremble that lived in him all the time now, worse in the mornings before his body warmed up. He didn't look up. He didn't say a word. He just cleaned up what he could and folded the wet napkin into a small square and set it aside. Brianna was already walking away, back to Tyler, back to whatever joke they were building between them. Margaret watched Walter finish his coffee, watched him nibble at the dry toast in small, careful bites, like a man who had all the time in the world and nowhere else to be. His eyes stayed on the window most of the meal, tracking cars that passed, tracking nothing at all, really, just watching the world go by without him in it. When he finished, he set his fork down neat and square on the plate, the way he always did. He reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and pulled out a small coin purse, brown leather gone soft and cracked with age, the clasp worn smooth from 30 years of thumbs working it open and shut. His hands trembled harder now, the shaking climbing up from his fingers into his wrists as he worked the clasp loose. It took him 3 tries. Margaret watched him do it and felt something twist low in her chest, the same feeling she got every single morning and never quite named. Coin by coin, he counted out the exact amount owed. $2.15 for the coffee and toast. He laid each coin down on the table with great care, lining them up in a neat little row like he was afraid of shorting Margaret by even a penny. A quarter. Another quarter. Dimes, nickels, his fingers fumbled twice, dropping a nickel that rolled across the table before he caught it against the napkin dispenser. From behind the counter, Tyler let out a low snort, quickly muffled behind his hand. Brianna bit her lip, shoulders shaking with the effort of holding in her laughter. Walter heard it. Margaret was sure he heard it. But he didn't look up, didn't react, didn't do anything but finish counting his coins and slide them into a small pile at the edge of the table. Then he pushed himself up out of the booth, joints creaking with the effort, and buttoned the top button of his jacket even though it was already buttoned all the way to his chin. He shuffled toward the door, past the counter, past Margaret, past the laughter he pretended not to hear. The bell jingled above the door as he pushed it open, and the cold morning air rushed in around him as he stepped out onto the sidewalk alone, disappearing down Main Street the way he did every single day, leaving nothing behind but a damp napkin and a small stack of coins. The next morning, the Sunrise Diner was packed tighter than Margaret had seen it in weeks. A group of high school boys had come in after some kind of early practice, all elbows and loud laughter, taking up the big table by the window. 3 regulars sat at the counter arguing about football. The Miller family had squeezed into the corner booth with their 2 kids, and the smell of bacon and pancake batter hung thick in the air. Margaret moved fast behind the counter, pouring coffee, calling out orders to Carlos through the kitchen window. She barely had time to look up when the bell above the door jingled at exactly 7 o'clock. Walter shuffled in. Same as always. Same brown jacket, buttoned to his chin. Same slow, careful steps toward his booth in the back corner. He settled into his seat and folded his hands on the table, waiting the way he always waited, patient as stone. Tyler was working the register, and he'd been showing off all morning for a table of his friends who'd wandered in around 6:30. 2 guys from the community college, loud and restless, the kind who laughed at everything and nothing. Tyler had been telling them stories between orders, puffing himself up, and Margaret had caught him glancing toward Walter's booth more than once, with that same old smirk creeping across his face. "Watch this," Tyler said to his friends, low enough that Margaret almost didn't catch it over the clatter of dishes. He grabbed a coffee pot he didn't need and swaggered over to Walter's booth like he was doing his job. Walter looked up at him, the way he always did, calm and unreadable. Tyler set the pot down on the table without pouring anything. Then, quick as a cat, he reached out and snatched Walter's hat right off his head. The old man's hand shot up too late, grabbing only air. Tyler held the hat high above his head, grinning back at his friends like he'd just pulled off some great magic trick. "Hey, Pop. Nice hair," Tyler called out, loud enough for half the diner to hear. His friends busted out laughing. One of them already had his phone up, filming, the little red light blinking steady. Walter's hands started shaking. Not the usual tremble he carried all the time, but something worse, something frantic, as he reached up again and again for a hat that wasn't there anymore. His fingers grasped at empty air above his bald head, missing each time, his whole arm trembling like a wire pulled too tight. "Come on, old man, you gotta reach higher than that," Tyler said, dangling the hat just out of range, laughing along with his friends now. Walter's breathing quickened. His hand shook so hard it knocked against his coffee cup, tipping it sideways. Hot coffee sloshed over the rim and splashed across his wrist, the dark liquid soaking into his jacket sleeve and scalding the thin skin underneath. He gasped, a small sharp sound, and yanked his arm back against his chest. His face twisted for just a second, pain flashing across features that had gone still and quiet for so many years. The burn left an angry red mark spreading up from his wrist, and his fingers curled inward, trembling worse than before. The diner erupted. Somebody at the counter laughed so hard they had to grab the edge to stay on their stool. The boys at the corner table hooted and slapped the table. Another phone came out, then another, all of them angled toward Walter's booth, red lights blinking, capturing the old man clutching his burned wrist while his hat dangled forgotten in Tyler's hand. "Oh man, did you get that?" One of Tyler's friends said between gasps of laughter. "That's gold." Brianna covered her mouth, shoulders shaking, though something flickered across her eyes that looked almost like she wanted to stop laughing and couldn't figure out how. Walter didn't say a word. He didn't cry out, didn't curse, didn't even look up at the phones pointed his way. He just sat there with his wrist cradled against his chest, the skin already blistering pink, his whole body trembling from more than just the burn now. His eyes dropped to the table, to the small puddle of spilled coffee spreading across the wood, and he stared at it the way a man stares at something he has seen 1,000 times before and learned, a long time ago, that there was no use fighting. His hand shook against his chest, red and raw, and still, he said nothing at all. The bell above the door jangled hard. Once, twice, the sound sharp and sudden against the noise of the diner. Every head turned. A man filled the doorway, broad-shouldered and tall, wearing a black leather vest covered in patches that caught the morning light. His arms were thick and roped with muscle, one of them wrapped in old tattoos that curled up from his wrist and disappeared under his sleeve. His boots were scuffed and worn from thousands of miles of road, and his face was weathered like leather left out in the sun too long, lines carved deep around his eyes and mouth. He had a gray-streaked beard trimmed close, and his eyes swept the room once, taking in everything, missing nothing. The laughter died in an instant. The boys with their phones lowered their arms without seeming to realize they were doing it. The community college kids at Tyler's table went quiet mid-laugh, their mouths still open but no sound coming out. Even the 3 men arguing about football at the counter stopped talking, turning slowly on their stools to look. Margaret froze behind the counter, coffee pot still tilted in her hand, a thin stream of coffee overflowing the cup she'd been filling and spreading across the countertop. She didn't notice. Her eyes were fixed on the man in the doorway. He didn't look angry. He didn't look like he was about to start trouble, not the way his size and his colors might have suggested to a stranger. His face was calm, almost gentle, but there was something in the way he stood, something solid and unmovable that made the whole room feel smaller than it had a moment before. Nobody moved. The man's eyes swept past the counter, past the corner booth full of kids, past the football men frozen on their stools, and landed on the back of the diner. On the old man in the brown jacket, sitting alone with his wrist pressed to his chest and his eyes down on a spreading puddle of coffee. Something shifted in the big man's face. Just for a second. A tightening around his eyes, like a wound reopening. He started walking. His boots hit the floor heavy, and even, each step deliberate, unhurried, he walked past Tyler, who still stood frozen with Walter's hat dangling from his fingers, forgotten now, his mouth slightly open. He walked past the phones still raised halfway, past the boys who didn't dare laugh anymore, past Margaret standing stunned behind her counter with coffee dripping onto the floor. Nobody said a word. Nobody breathed too loud. He reached Walter's booth and stopped. For a moment he just stood there, looking down at the old man, at the burn spreading red and angry across his wrist, at the way his whole body curled inward like he was trying to disappear into himself. Something moved behind the big man's eyes, something that looked almost like grief, almost like relief, both tangled up together in a way that didn't make sense to anyone watching. Then he slid into the booth across from Walter, the old vinyl seat creaking under his weight, and the whole diner watched in silence as he reached across the table. His hand, big and scarred and marked with faded ink, closed gently around Walter's trembling, burned one. Walter flinched at the touch, his eyes lifting for the first time, confusion flickering across his face as he looked at the stranger holding his hand like it was something precious, something that mattered. The big man's thumb moved slow and careful over the old man's knuckles, steadying the shake, the way you'd calm a frightened animal, patient and sure. "Morning, Pop," he said. His voice was quiet, rough at the edges like gravel, but there was nothing hard in it. It carried through the silent diner clear as a bell, and every single person in that room heard it, though none of them understood what it meant. Tyler's hand slowly lowered, the hat slipping from his fingers and falling soundlessly to the floor. The phone stayed raised, forgotten, nobody remembering to press record or stop recording, everyone frozen in the same confused, tense silence that had swallowed the whole diner whole. Nobody said a word. Nobody understood. But something had changed, and everybody in that room could feel it, thick in the air like the smell of coffee and grease, impossible to ignore. Tyler shifted his weight, glancing at his friends. He needed to say something. The silence was pressing down on him like a wet blanket, and every second that passed made him feel smaller in front of the people who'd been laughing with him just moments before. "What is this?" he said, forcing a laugh that came out thin and shaky. The geezer's new babysitter? A few nervous chuckles rippled through the corner booth. The community college kids looked at each other, unsure if it was safe to laugh, but Tyler's tone had given them permission, and a couple of them took it, snickering into their hands. Jake didn't turn his head right away. He kept his eyes on Walter, on the burn spreading across the old man's wrist, on the way Walter's fingers still trembled beneath his own. He gave Walter's hand one more gentle squeeze, like he was telling him to hold on, and then he looked up. His eyes found Tyler across the diner. He didn't glare. He didn't scowl. His face stayed calm, almost soft, but there was a weight behind his gaze that made Tyler's grin falter and slide right off his face. "Funny," Jake said quietly. "You want to know something funnier?" Nobody laughed this time. Jake let go of Walter's hand, slow and careful, making sure the old man's arm rested steady on the table before he moved. Then, without any hurry at all, he reached for the cuff of his own sleeve and began to roll it up, one fold at a time, his thick fingers working the leather and denim back past his elbow. The diner watched in silence. Even the football men at the counter had turned all the way around on their stools now, forgetting their coffee, forgetting their argument, forgetting everything except the big man in the corner booth, slowly baring his arm like he was about to show them something they'd remember for the rest of their lives. And he was. There, inked into the skin of his forearm, faded just enough to show its age, but clear enough to read every line, was a tattoo. A phoenix, wings spread wide, wrapped around a motorcycle wheel, its tail feathers curling down into the spokes like flame licking through metal. Underneath it, in bold letters gone soft at the edges from 30 years of sun and skin, were 2 words. Higgins Riders. "Anybody know what this is?" Jake asked. His voice was still quiet, still calm. But it filled the diner like it was the only sound left in the world. Nobody answered. Nobody moved. Tyler's mouth opened, but nothing came out. Jake nodded slowly, like he'd expected that. Like he'd carried this moment with him for 30 years, turning it over and over, waiting for the day he'd finally get to show someone. He turned back to Walter. "Pop," he said softly. "Can I?" Walter's eyes were wide, glassy, fixed on Jake's arm like he was looking at a ghost. He didn't answer, not with words, but something in his face shifted, some old wall cracking just slightly, and he gave the smallest nod anyone in that diner had ever seen. Jake reached across the table, slow and gentle, and with 2 fingers he pulled back the collar of Walter's faded brown jacket, easing it down just enough to expose the side of his neck. There, etched into skin gone thin and spotted with age, nearly swallowed by wrinkles and years, was the same mark. The same phoenix, the same wheel. The ink so faded it was almost a shadow of itself, but unmistakable once you knew what you were looking at. Higgins Riders. The diner fell into a silence so complete that the hum of the refrigerator behind the counter seemed suddenly loud. Margaret's hand had gone still, the coffee pot forgotten in her grip. Tyler stood frozen, the hat he'd dropped still lying at his feet, his face drained of every ounce of the smugness it had carried a minute before. Nobody laughed. Nobody spoke. Every eye in the Sunrise Diner was locked on the 2 matching marks, one bold and dark, one pale and faded, joined together across a table that suddenly felt like it was holding something much bigger than coffee cups and dry toast. Jake let Walter's collar fall back into place, careful as a man handling something made of glass. He didn't sit up straight or raise his voice. He just started talking, the way a man talks when he's been holding words in for a very long time and finally lets them out slow, so he doesn't lose any of them along the way. 1987, Jake said. October, there was an orphanage up on Miller's Ridge, other side of the county line. Old building, wood frame, the kind of place that goes up fast once it starts burning. He looked down at his own arm, at the phoenix wrapped around the wheel, like the ink itself was helping him remember. It caught fire late at night. Nobody knows exactly how it started. Faulty wiring, maybe. Doesn't matter now. What matters is the only road up that mountain was already blocked. A tree had come down in a storm 2 days before, and the county hadn't cleared it yet. Fire trucks couldn't get through. Ambulances couldn't get through. There were 30 kids in that building, and the fire department was still 15 minutes out, stuck on the wrong side of a tree the size of a school bus. Margaret had set the coffee pot down on the counter without seeming to notice she'd done it. Every face in the diner had turned toward Jake now, even the football men, even the community college kids who'd been laughing along with Tyler a few minutes before. Motorcycles could get through, Jake said. Bikes are narrow. They can cut around a blocked road, go through ditches, cross a footpath if they have to. And there was a man in this town back then who knew that better than anyone. He rode with a small group, nothing official, just guys who liked their bikes and liked helping folks when they could. When word came in about the fire, this man didn't wait for anybody's permission. He got on his bike, went door to door waking up every rider he knew, and led them straight up that mountain, while the road crews were still arguing about how to move the tree. He paused. His jaw worked once, like the next part was heavier than the rest. They got there before the fire trucks did. The building was already half gone, smoke so thick you couldn't see your own hand in front of your face. And this man, he didn't stand back and wait. He went in. Him and his riders, they went in and out of that building over and over, carrying kids out on their backs, on their handlebars, however they could hold on to them, and they got them down that mountain on motorcycles, because there was no other way down. Tyler's phone was still raised, but his thumb had gone still on the screen. Nobody was laughing now. Nobody was even breathing very loud. "I was 7 years old," Jake said, and his voice caught for just a second, just enough that everyone in the diner heard it. "I was in that building. I remember the smoke. I remember somebody's arms picking me up when I couldn't stop coughing, and I remember being set down on the back of a motorcycle seat and being told to hold on tight and not let go no matter what. I remember the wind on my face going down that mountain, and I remember looking back and seeing the roof come down behind us." He looked at Walter now, and his eyes were wet, though he didn't seem ashamed of it. "This man saved 11 kids that night," Jake said, loud enough now that it carried to every corner of the Sunrise Diner. 11 kids who had nobody else coming for them. I'm one of them. I've spent 30 years trying to find out who put me on the back of that bike. 30 years, and I finally found him. Sitting in a diner in Millbrook Falls, ordering black coffee and dry toast every single morning, and nobody in this whole town knew who he was. The diner didn't move. Tyler's phone lowered slowly to his side, the video still running, forgotten, his face gone pale and stricken. Margaret pressed a hand over her mouth. Somewhere near the counter, one of the football men wiped roughly at his eyes with the back of his hand and didn't try to hide it. Walter sat very still, his trembling hands folded now on the table in front of him, his eyes fixed somewhere far away, as if he were back on that mountain, hearing the fire again, feeling the weight of a small boy holding on tight behind him. The murmurs started low, like water finding its way through cracks. A woman near the window whispered, "Oh my word," over and over. One of the football men said, "I can't believe it," to nobody in particular. Tyler stood frozen by the counter, his phone hanging at his side, his mouth opening and closing like he wanted to say something but couldn't find the words. Margaret came around the counter slow, her hand still pressed to her chest. She stopped a few feet from the booth, looking down at Walter like she was seeing him for the first time in 20 years of pouring his coffee. "Walter," she said, and her voice cracked on his name. "Walter, I had no idea. All this time, I had no idea." Other voices joined hers. An older man 2 booths down said, "I'm sorry, old-timer. I never should have laughed at you." A woman who'd filmed the hat incident on her phone lowered it to the table, her face red with shame. The apologies came soft and stumbling, one after another, filling up the diner like a tide coming in. Walter didn't look at any of them. He sat with his hands folded, his eyes still far away, still somewhere up on that mountain 35 years gone. His jaw trembled. His shoulders had started to shake, just slightly, the way a man shakes when he's holding something back that's too big to hold. Jake reached across the table and put his hand over Walter's folded hands, the way he had before. "Pop," he said gently. "It's all right. You don't have to say anything. I just wanted them to know." But Walter was already opening his mouth. And when he spoke, His voice came out rough and cracked, like something unused for a very long time, like a door hinge that hadn't been oiled in decades. 11 made it out, Walter said. The diner went quiet again, quieter than before. There were 12. The words hung in the air. Jake's hand went still on top of Walter's. His face changed, the color draining out of it slow, like he was hearing something he'd never once considered in 30 years of wondering. "Pop," Jake said carefully. "What do you mean, 12? Walter's eyes finally focused, but not on Jake, not on Margaret, not on anyone in the diner. They focused on something only he could see. Something that had been sitting behind his eyes for 35 years, waiting for this exact moment to come crawling back out. His breath came ragged. His hands, still trembling under Jake's, curled into fists. 12, he said again, and this time his voice broke clean in half, and a sound came out of him that wasn't quite a sob and wasn't quite a groan, but something in between. Something that had been held down so long it didn't know how to come out gentle anymore. Then, before Jake could say another word, before Margaret could reach for him, Walter stood up. He stood up so fast the table rocked, his coffee cup rattling in its saucer. He reached into his jacket pocket with a shaking hand and pulled out a worn leather billfold, and he dropped a few bills onto the table without counting them, without looking at them, his hands moving on pure old habit even while the rest of him seemed to be falling apart. "Pop, wait," Jake said, standing up too, reaching for him. "Wait, just tell me what happened, please." But Walter was already moving. He pushed past the booth, past Margaret, past the stunned faces of the football men and the college kids, and Tyler standing frozen by the counter. He walked fast for a man his age, his faded brown jacket flapping open now, his shoulders hunched like he was trying to make himself small enough to disappear. He shoved the diner door open. The bell jangled hard, frantic, nothing like its usual polite chime. Outside, the rain had started, coming down gray and steady over Millbrook Falls, and Walter walked straight out into it without an umbrella, without his hat, without looking back once. Jake stood there in the middle of the diner, his hand still half raised from reaching for a man who was no longer there to catch. The rain hit the window in sheets. Through the glass, Walter's shape grew smaller down the sidewalk, his jacket soaking through, his steps quick and unsteady. The whole diner stared at Jake now, waiting for an explanation, waiting for the rest of the story he was supposed to know. Jake turned to face them, and his face was stricken. Lost, nothing like the calm certainty he'd carried in with him a few minutes before. "I don't know," he said quietly, to Margaret, to Tyler, to the whole silent room. "I don't know what he means. I've never heard anything about a 12th kid. I don't know this part of the story." He looked back through the window, watching Walter's shape grow smaller and smaller in the rain, until the old man turned a corner and was gone. The Sunrise Diner was empty except for the hum of the coffee machine when Jake pushed through the door at 6:15 the next morning. Margaret was already there, wiping down the counter, her eyes red-rimmed like she hadn't slept much either. She looked up when the bell jangled. "You look like you've been drugged behind a truck," she said. "Feels about right." Jake sat down heavy on a stool at the counter, his leather jacket still damp from the rain that had never really let up all night. He rubbed a hand over his face. "I went looking for him." After he left. Margaret set down her rag. "And?" Took me a while. Asked around at the gas station, the hardware store, anybody who might know where an old man like that lives. Finally, an old fella at the feed store told me about a house out on Miller Road, edge of town, past where the pavement gives out. Jake shook his head slow. It's small. Falling apart, honestly, paint peeling everywhere, porch sagging on one side like it's tired of holding itself up. Didn't look like anybody had touched that place in years. You knocked? Knocked for 20 minutes. Jake's jaw tightened at the memory. I could see a light on inside. Just one, in the back room. I called out to him, told him it was me, told him I just wanted to talk, that I wasn't there to make him say anything he didn't want to say. He paused, staring down at his hands, scarred and rough from years of engine work and road miles. He never answered, never came to the door, but the light stayed on the whole time I was standing there. So I know he was awake. I know he heard me. Margaret leaned against the counter, arms crossed, listening. I sat down on his porch steps for a while, Jake went on. Just sat there in the rain like an idiot, hoping maybe if I waited long enough he'd change his mind. He didn't. Around midnight I figured I was doing more harm than good, banging on an old man's door in a storm, so I left. He let out a breath that sounded like it had been sitting in his chest a long time. I keep thinking about that sound he made, Margaret in the diner. That wasn't just an old memory bothering him. That was something that's been eating him alive for 35 years. Margaret's eyes went soft. 12 kids, she murmured. He said there were 12. And far as everybody's always known, he saved 11. So somewhere in that story is a kid nobody's ever heard of. A kid Walter's been carrying around inside him this whole time. Jake shook his head again, slower this time. And I pushed him. I came in here yesterday all fired up, thinking I was doing something good, showing everybody what kind of man he really is. Never once stopped to think there might be a piece of this he wasn't ready to show. Margaret reached over and poured him a cup of coffee without being asked, sliding it across the counter. You didn't know. Don't matter if I knew or not. I still did it. Jake wrapped both hands around the warm mug, but didn't drink from it. He just stared into it like the answer might be floating somewhere in the black surface. I've been trying to figure out all night what I'm supposed to do now. How I fix something like this. Maybe you don't fix it, Margaret said gently. Maybe you just show up. Jake looked up at her. That man's been alone with this for 35 years, Margaret said. Nobody pushed their way into that. It took time, and it'll take time to come back out of it, too. You can't force a man to trust you just because you want to help him. Jake sat with that for a long moment, the coffee machine gurgling behind the counter, the gray morning light just starting to creep through the windows. Then he nodded slow, like something inside him had settled into place. All right, he said quietly. Then that's what I'll do. He carried his coffee over to Walter's usual booth, the one by the window, and sat down across from the empty seat, facing the door. He set his hands flat on the table, and he waited, watching the clock above the counter tick slowly toward 7. At 7 o'clock sharp, the bell above the door jangled. Walter shuffled in wearing the same faded brown jacket, buttoned to his chin, his eyes down on the floor the way they always were. He took 2 steps toward his booth before he saw who was sitting there, and his whole body went still. Jake didn't move. He just sat with his hands folded on the table, looking back at him steady and calm, the way you'd look at a spooked horse you didn't want to startle. Walter's eyes darted to the door, like he was thinking about turning right back around. His fingers twitched at his sides. The rain from last night had left dark circles under his eyes, and his skin looked gray and thin, like paper that had been folded too many times. Margaret stood behind the counter, pretending to wipe down a spot that was already clean, watching out of the corner of her eye but saying nothing. Seconds ticked by. Walter stood frozen halfway between the door and the booth, caught between two choices, his shoulders hunched like he was bracing for something. Then, slowly, he walked forward. He didn't look at Jake as he sat down across from him, easing into the booth like his knees hurt, which they probably did. He kept his eyes on the table, on his own folded hands, on anything that wasn't Jake's face. Jake didn't say a word. He didn't smile, didn't reach out, didn't do anything that might make Walter bolt. He just gave a small nod, like he was saying good morning without using the words, and then he looked down at his own coffee. Margaret came over a minute later with the coffee pot and 2 plates, black coffee and dry toast for Walter, same as always, and eggs and toast for Jake. She set them down quiet and didn't linger, walking back behind the counter to give them space. The diner was mostly empty. A couple of early risers sat near the window, an old farmer reading a folded newspaper, a mother with a toddler in a high chair. Nobody paid the booth by the window any mind, not the way they had 2 days ago when phones were out and laughter was cruel. Walter picked up his toast with a shaking hand and took a small bite. Jake ate his eggs slow, methodical, giving Walter all the time and space he needed. Neither of them spoke. The quiet between them wasn't the kind of quiet that hurts. It was careful, measured, like 2 men walking across ice, testing each step before putting their full weight down. Jake watched Walter out of the corner of his eye, watched the way his hands trembled less as the minutes passed, watched him relax by inches, his shoulders coming down from around his ears, his breathing slowing. Once, Walter looked up, just for a second, and their eyes met. Jake held his gaze steady, didn't look away, didn't press. Walter looked back down at his toast a moment later, but something in his face had shifted, just barely. Like a door that wasn't open, but wasn't locked either. The coffee cups emptied. The toast disappeared, crumb by crumb. Outside, the gray morning light strengthened into something closer to gold as the sun climbed over the rooftops across the street. Finally, Walter reached into his jacket pocket, the same way he did every morning, and pulled out exact change. He set the coins on the table in a neat little stack, same as always, and started to slide out of the booth. His hands gripped the edge of the table, knuckles white, pushing himself up slow and stiff. Jake watched him stand, watched him straighten his jacket, watched him take 1 step toward the door. "Same time tomorrow?" Jake said. His voice was quiet. Not a question that demanded an answer, just an offer, laid out plain and simple, the way you'd leave a light on for somebody who might come home. Walter stopped walking. He stood there for a long moment, his back to Jake, one hand braced against the back of the empty booth beside him. The diner was silent, except for the hum of the coffee machine and the soft clatter of a spoon against a mug somewhere behind the counter. Walter didn't turn around. But after a long, long pause, his head dipped down, just barely, just the smallest fraction of an inch. A nod. Small enough that if you weren't watching close, you might have missed it entirely. Then he shuffled toward the door, pushed it open, and stepped out into the morning light, the bell jangling softly behind him. That evening, Margaret locked the front door of the diner and flipped the sign to closed. The dinner rush had been light, just a few regulars trickling in for pie and coffee, and now the place sat empty and quiet. The chairs still pushed in around the tables, the floor swept clean. She stood behind the counter for a moment, looking out at the dark street through the front window. The streetlight outside flickered on, casting a soft orange glow over the empty sidewalk. Somewhere down the block, a dog barked twice and then went quiet. Margaret rubbed the back of her neck. It had been a long day, and her feet ached from standing on them since 5 in the morning, but her mind wasn't on her feet. It was on Walter, on the way he'd sat frozen in the doorway that morning, on the tiny nod he'd given Jake before walking out into the light. She walked to the back of the diner, past the kitchen where Carlos had already gone home for the night, and pushed open the door to her small office. It wasn't much, just a cramped room with a metal desk, a rolling chair with a wobbly wheel, and a filing cabinet that had been there since her husband ran the place, decades before she'd taken it over. She sat down at the desk and pulled open the bottom drawer of the cabinet. It stuck, the way it always did, and she had to yank twice before it gave. Inside, folders were stacked in no particular order, old receipts and tax records and photographs from town events long since forgotten. She dug past all of it, her fingers searching for something specific, something she hadn't touched in years but had never been able to throw away. Near the bottom, tucked inside a plastic sleeve gone yellow with age, she found it. A newspaper clipping. She pulled it out carefully, the paper brittle at the edges, and set it down under the desk lamp. The light hummed and buzzed above her as she smoothed the clipping flat with her palm. The photograph was grainy, black and white, taken from a distance. It showed a line of motorcycles parked along a smoke-filled road, headlights cutting through the haze. In the foreground, barely visible, was the shape of a man carrying a child, his face turned away from the camera, his features lost in shadow and smoke. The caption beneath the photo read, "Unnamed rescuer aids in orphanage evacuation." Margaret had kept this clipping for 20 years. She'd found it while cleaning out her husband's desk after he passed, tucked inside an old ledger book, and she'd never known why he'd saved it. She only knew it felt important, the way certain things do even when you can't explain why, and so she'd kept it, moving it from drawer to drawer over the years, never quite able to let it go. She stared at the photograph now. Really looked at it, the way she hadn't in years. The shape of the man's shoulders, the angle of his head, the way he held the child close against his chest, like he was shielding him from the whole burning world. Her breath caught. It could be him. It could be Walter. She sat back in her chair, her heart starting to pound, and reached for the folder beside the clipping, the one with her husband's old land records, the papers she'd kept out of sentiment more than necessity. She flipped through the yellowed pages until she found it. The deed. The donation. Her husband's family had given the land for the rebuilt orphanage back in 1988, less than a year after the fire. Margaret's hands went cold. She had lived in this town her whole life. She had heard about the fire the way everyone had, as a tragedy from long ago, a story told in fragments. She had never known, never once considered, that her own family's land sat beneath the very building that had risen from those ashes. She had never connected the dots, not until this very moment, sitting alone in her office with a 20-year-old newspaper, clipping trembling in her hands. She had been connected to this story the whole time. and she hadn't even known it. Margaret set the clipping down gently, like it might break, and pulled open the top drawer of her desk. She found a notepad and a pen, and beneath the lamp's yellow light, she began to write. County Archive. Fire Department records. Orphanage intake files. Who do I know? Her handwriting grew faster, more determined, as the names came back to her one by one. Jake spent that week making phone calls. He sat on the back of his motorcycle outside his apartment, phone pressed to his ear, going through names in an old address book he'd carried for years without ever using. Some of the numbers were disconnected. Some led to strangers who had bought a house from someone who had moved away long ago. But some of them worked. "This is going to sound crazy," he'd say when someone finally answered. "But my name is Jake Malone. I think you might remember me. I think you might remember the fire." Most people went quiet on the other end of the line. Then they'd ask him to say it again, slower this time, because they couldn't believe what they were hearing. By the end of the week, Jake had found 6 of them. 6 of the 11 children Walter had carried out that night, now grown into adults with jobs and spouses and kids of their own. A woman named Denise, who ran a flower shop 2 towns over. A man named Robert, who taught high school math. Twins, Sarah and Michael, who hadn't spoken to each other about the fire in over 20 years because neither one knew how to bring it up. They all said yes. Every single one of them. Margaret helped Jake plan it. She closed the diner early on a Thursday and pushed the tables together into one long row down the center of the room. She strung up simple paper lanterns, the kind she kept in a box in the storeroom from town festivals years back, and she baked 3 pies the night before because she said a gathering wasn't a gathering without pie. "You think he'll come?" Jake asked her that afternoon, standing in the doorway of the kitchen while Margaret rolled out dough. "He'll come," Margaret said. "Carlos already told him lunch was on the house today. That man doesn't turn down free food." Jake laughed, but his hands were shaking a little as he set out the folding chairs. He hadn't felt nervous like this in years, not since he'd ridden his motorcycle for the first time after getting his license all those decades ago. This felt bigger than that. This felt like something he needed to get right. Walter showed up at 6 o'clock, same as always, wearing his brown jacket buttoned to his chin. He stopped in the doorway when he saw the tables pushed together, the lanterns glowing soft and warm above them, the pies sitting on the counter. "What is all this?" he said quietly. "Sit down, Pop," Jake said, guiding him gently toward the head of the table. "You'll see." Walter sat, confused, his hands folding together in his lap the way they always did when he didn't know what to do with them. The bell above the door jangled. Denise walked in first, a woman in her 40s with soft brown hair and tears already welling in her eyes. She stopped in front of Walter's chair and just looked at him for a long moment. "You probably don't remember me," she said, her voice trembling. "I was 5. You carried me on your bike. I still remember your jacket. I used to grab onto it so tight." Walter stared up at her, his mouth opening slightly, no words coming out. "Thank you," Denise whispered, and then she was crying, kneeling down beside his chair and wrapping her arms around his neck. Walter sat frozen, his hands hovering in the air before slowly, carefully, coming to rest on her back. More of them came in after that. Robert, tall and broad-shouldered now, shook Walter's hand and then pulled him into a hug anyway, saying he'd spent 30 years wondering what happened to the man who saved him. Sarah and Michael came in together, the twins, both of them crying before they even reached the table, telling Walter they finally understood why their mother used to light a candle every year on the anniversary of the fire. One by one, they came. Grown men and women, some with their own children trailing behind them, all of them approaching Walter's chair with the same trembling gratitude, the same tearful thanks that had waited decades to be spoken out loud. Walter said little. He nodded. He held their hands. He let them hug him, even when his body went stiff at first, unused to the touch, unused to being seen. Margaret stood near the counter, watching, a dish towel pressed to her mouth. Jake stood beside Walter's chair the whole time, one hand resting on the old man's shoulder, steady and warm. As the evening wound down, the paper lanterns glowing softer now, the last of the guests lingering over pie and coffee, Walter sat quietly in his chair, overwhelmed, his eyes wet and shining in the lamplight. And slowly, for the first time in longer than anyone could remember, the corner of his mouth lifted. Just barely. Just the faint beginning of a smile. The bell above the diner door jangled at 7 o'clock sharp, same as always. Margaret looked up from the coffee pot, ready to call out her usual greeting to Walter, and stopped. His jacket hung open. Not wide open, not thrown back careless like a young man might wear it. Just unbuttoned. The top button undone, then the next, all the way down, so the brown fabric swayed a little as he walked, showing the plain gray shirt underneath. Margaret set the coffee pot down slower than she needed to. Jake was already at the counter, stirring sugar into his own cup, and when he looked up and saw Walter coming through the door that way, his spoon stopped moving. He glanced at Margaret. Margaret glanced back at him. Neither one said anything, but something passed between them, quick and warm, like two people who had been waiting a long time for a small sign and had finally gotten it. "Morning, Walter," Margaret said, keeping her voice light, like it was any other day. "Morning," Walter said. He shuffled to his booth, the same booth he always sat in, and lowered himself into it with the same careful stiffness in his knees. But he didn't reach up to button the jacket the way he usually did once he'd settled. He just sat there, jacket open, hands folding in his lap. Jake picked up his coffee and walked over, the way he'd done every morning that week. "Mind if I sit?" Walter shrugged, which was as close to an invitation as he ever gave, and Jake slid into the seat across from him. Margaret brought over the coffee pot herself, filling Walter's cup without being asked, and she let her hand rest for just a second on the edge of the table. "You look good today, Walter," she said. Walter's eyes flicked up to her, surprised, like he wasn't sure what to do with a compliment. "Just a jacket," he mumbled. "Sure," Margaret said, smiling, and walked away before he could see how much it meant to her. Jake wrapped both hands around his coffee cup and let the quiet settle between them, same as he had every morning since the dinner. He'd learned not to push. He'd learned that Walter needed the silence first, needed to know nobody was going to demand anything from him. Before he'd offer up anything on his own. They sat like that for a while, the diner humming quietly around them, the clatter of dishes from the kitchen, the low murmur of the breakfast crowd. Carlos moved behind the counter, flipping eggs, glancing over now and then the way he always did, though nobody thought anything of it yet. Walter took a sip of his coffee. His hand, Jake noticed, was steadier than it used to be. "That fire," Walter said suddenly. Jake went very still. He didn't move, didn't lean forward, Didn't do anything that might make Walter feel like he was being watched too closely. He just kept his hands around his cup and said, quietly, "Yeah?" Walter stared down at the table, at some spot on the wood only he could see. "There was so much smoke," he said. "Couldn't hardly see 3 feet in front of you. Just black, thick smoke, rolling out the windows before the flames even showed themselves good." Jake said nothing. He waited. Kids were screaming. Walter went on, his voice low and rough, like it hadn't been used for this kind of talking in a very long time. Some of them just froze up, didn't know which way to run. "I remember this one little girl, she just stood there in the yard, not moving, like her legs forgot how to work." He paused. His hands tightened around his cup. "We didn't have no plan," Walter said. "Wasn't like we sat down and figured it out ahead of time. We just started grabbing kids and putting them on the bikes. 2 at a time. Sometimes 3 if they were small enough. I had this one boy holding onto my jacket so tight I thought he was going to tear the seam." Jake's throat tightened, but he kept quiet, kept his face steady, kept listening. "Engines going, kids crying, that fire roaring behind us like it was alive," Walter said. "I didn't think. Just kept going back for more." He stopped there. His eyes went distant, somewhere far off in 1987, and Jake didn't say a word to bring him back. He just sat there, patient, letting the old man have his silence again when he needed it. The county archive was in the basement of the Millbrook Falls courthouse, down a set of stairs that smelled like old paper and dust, and something faintly like rain that never quite dried. Margaret had been coming here 3 nights a week for almost a month now after she closed up the diner, telling Walter and everyone else she had errands to run. She didn't like lying, not even a small one, but she wasn't ready to say anything until she had something real to show for it. The archive clerk, a thin young man named Owen who wore glasses too big for his face, had gotten used to her by now. He didn't ask questions anymore when she came in and headed straight for the back room where the older county records were kept. Boxes stacked on metal shelves that reached almost to the ceiling. It had taken 2 weeks just to find the right box. The orphanage records from the 80s were scattered across different filing systems, some of them transferred to microfilm, some of them lost entirely when the county switched over to digital storage years ago. But tonight, Margaret had finally found it. A cardboard box, soft at the corners, with a faded label that read Millbrook County Children's Home, 1985 to 1988. Her hands were shaking a little as she lifted the lid. Inside were folders, yellowed with age, some of them held together with rubber bands that had gone brittle and snapped the moment she touched them. She sorted through carefully, setting aside anything that didn't have a date close to the fire, until she found it. A ledger, bound in cracked leather, the pages inside filled with careful looping handwriting that had faded to a soft brown. She carried it to the table under the single hanging light bulb and sat down, her heart beating faster than she wanted to admit. The ledger was an intake record, listing every child who had come through the orphanage's doors, their names, their ages, the dates they arrived. Margaret ran her finger down the columns slowly, mouthing some of the names to herself. Most of them meant nothing to her. But then, she found a page, near the back, dated just days before the fire, and her breath caught. It was a list, a simple, handwritten list of children in care as of that week in October 1987. She counted them. 1, 2, 3. She kept going, her finger moving down the page, until she reached the bottom. 12 names. Margaret sat back in her chair, staring at the number. 12. Not 11. She pulled out her phone and opened the Notes app, where she'd been keeping a running list of everything Jake had told her, everything from that morning at the diner when he'd rolled up his sleeve and changed everything. 11 kids. That was the number everyone knew. That was the number in every story, the number Jake himself had said out loud in front of the whole diner. 11 made it out. But the ledger said 12 had been there. Her eyes moved to another sheet tucked into the same folder, a checklist scrawled in a different hand, hurried and messy, clearly written in the chaos of the days right after the fire. It listed children accounted for, checked off one by one against the intake list. She matched the names against Jake's account, against the fragments Walter had given up over these past weeks. 11 check marks. 11 names crossed off as safe. One name at the bottom had no check mark at all. Margaret's hand went still over the page. She read the name twice, 3 times, like she was afraid it might change if she looked away and looked back. She thought of Walter's voice breaking in the diner that first day. 11 made it out. There were 12. Her chest tightened. She wasn't imagining it. He hadn't misspoken, hadn't confused himself in some fog of old age and memory. There really had been a 12th child. A child the ledger showed enrolled, present, accounted for right up until the days before the fire. And then, nothing. No checkmark. No note. Just an empty space where an answer should have been. Margaret pulled out her phone again, hands trembling slightly, and took a photograph of the page, then another of the checklist beside it, making sure the names were clear and readable. She sat there for a long moment after, staring at the boxes and folders scattered across the table, feeling the weight of what she'd found settle over her. She needed to find Jake. Before she said a single word of this to Walter. The diner was dark, except for the light over the back booth, the one Margaret always left on when she was doing paperwork after closing. She'd texted Jake one line, "Need to talk." Come to the diner tonight. He'd shown up 20 minutes later, still in his leather jacket, boots heavy on the tile floor. He slid into the booth across from her. "You something." "I found something," Margaret said. Her voice was quiet, careful, like she was handling glass. She pulled out her phone and set it on the table between them, the photo of the ledger page glowing on the screen. There were 12 kids listed at the orphanage that week, not 11. Jake picked up the phone and stared at it for a long moment. His jaw tightened. Walter said that. Right there in the diner, everybody heard him say it, and I told myself he was just confused. Old man, bad memory, grief messing with the numbers. He wasn't confused. Margaret pointed at the second photo, the checklist with its row of check marks. 11 were accounted for. One name has nothing next to it. No mark. Nothing. Jake set the phone down slowly. He rubbed a hand over his face, the kind of tired that went deeper than a long day. So there was a 12th kid. And nobody ever figured out what happened to him. Not that I can find yet, Margaret said. But I'm not done looking. There's more boxes. Hospital records, maybe, if the county kept anything from that far back. Jake looked at her, and for a second the tough exterior cracked just enough to show how tired he really was underneath it. We can't tell him. Not yet. Not until we know something real. He's barely holding it together as it is. If we go to him with half an answer, it'll break him." "I agree," Margaret said. "But Jake, I can't just keep digging in a basement forever and let him keep eating breakfast alone every morning like nothing's happening. He needs something now. Something good." Jake leaned back against the booth, thinking. Outside, the streetlight buzzed and flickered over the empty parking lot. What if we give him that? Something good, I mean. Before we know the whole truth. A night where he gets to see what he built. All those kids he saved, grown up, alive, with families of their own. Maybe that's enough to carry him until we figure out the rest. Margaret's eyes brightened, just a little. A dinner. Right here. We could do it right, Jake, not some little thank you card taped to his coffee cup. A real dinner. Invite everybody he saved. Let him see all of it at once. "He's gonna hate all the attention," Jake said, but there was a small smile pulling at the corner of his mouth. "He's gonna hate it for about 10 minutes, Margaret said, "and then he's gonna feel something he hasn't felt in 35 years. I'd bet the diner on it." Jake nodded slowly. "All right, let's do it. I'll call the writers. Every single one of them who's still around. They'll come. They've been asking me for weeks when they'd get the chance. I'll handle the diner," Margaret said. "Decorations, food, all of it. We can close early that day, set up before evening." They sat there another few minutes, working out details, Margaret scribbling notes on the back of an old receipt pad, Jake tapping out messages on his phone to names saved under nicknames from another lifetime. By the time Jake left, the plan had a shape to it. Simple but solid. A dinner. A celebration. Something good, before the harder truth came looking for them. The next morning, Margaret printed off a stack of paper flyers on the diner's old printer, the ink coming out a little streaky on the edges. "Tribute dinner for Walter Higgins," they read, with the date and time printed below in bold letters. She taped one to the diner's front window and handed a stack to Tyler before his shift even started. "Put these up around town," she said. "Grocery store, library, the gas station on Main. Everywhere you can think of." Tyler took the flyers without a word of complaint, something that would have surprised Margaret a month ago. He looked down at Walter's name printed there, and something crossed his face. Quiet and thoughtful. By that afternoon, word had already started moving through Millbrook Falls the way it always did, one person telling another over a fence or across a counter. The woman who ran the flower shop called Margaret to ask if she needed centerpieces, refusing to take payment. The high school football coach, who used to roll his eyes every time Walter fumbled with his wallet, showed up at the diner asking if the tables needed moving. Even old Mrs. Petrie, who had laughed the loudest that morning Tyler snatched Walter's hat, came by with a casserole dish and offered to help cook. The sun had gone down behind the water tower by the time Jake's truck pulled up outside Walter's little house on Elm Street. The porch light was off. Same as always. Jake climbed the steps and knocked twice. Walter opened the door in his brown jacket, buttoned to the chin, even though it was warm out. "You're not taking me to the doctor again," he said. "I told you, I don't need my blood pressure checked twice in 1 month." "Not the doctor," Jake said. "Just come with me tonight, Pop. Trust me on this one." Walter studied him a long moment, the way he studied everything, careful and slow. Then he sighed and grabbed his keys off the hook by the door. "Fine, but if this is a surprise party, I'm walking straight back home." Jake didn't answer. He just smiled and held the truck door open. They drove through town in near silence, the radio low. The streets quiet the way they always were in Millbrook Falls after dark. But as they turned onto Main Street, something looked different. Light spilled out of the diner windows, warm and gold, stretching across the sidewalk. Cars lined both sides of the street, more cars than Walter had ever seen parked outside the Sunrise Diner at once. "Jake," Walter said slowly. "What did you do?" "I didn't do anything," Jake said, pulling into a spot near the door. "This was Margaret. And the whole town, honestly, I just made some phone calls." Walter's hands went still in his lap. He stared through the windshield at the diner, transformed, string lights crisscrossed above the windows, little white bulbs glowing against the evening sky. Someone had tied bunches of flowers to the lampposts out front. Through the glass, he could see the place packed shoulder to shoulder, more people than the diner had ever held for a Tuesday breakfast rush, let alone a Thursday night. "I can't," Walter whispered. "Jake, I can't go in there." Jake reached over and put a hand on his shoulder, steady and warm. "Yes, you can. Because in there is every single person you gave a second chance to. And they've been waiting 35 years to say thank you. Let them." Walter's throat worked. He didn't say anything, but he nodded, just barely, and opened the truck door. The moment he stepped through the diner's entrance, the noise inside dropped like someone had thrown a switch. Every face turned toward him, grown men and women, some with children of their own tugging at their sleeves, all looking at the old man in the brown jacket, standing frozen in the doorway. Then, one by one, they started to clap. The sound built, spreading through the room, until the whole diner rang with it. Applause and a few whoops from the back. Someone's kid clapping both hands over their head just because everyone else was doing it. Walter's eyes went wide. He looked like a man who'd walked into the wrong room, like he might turn and bolt back out into the night. Jake kept a hand on his back, steady, guiding him forward past the counter where Margaret stood beaming, past tables crowded with people he didn't recognize, but who all seemed to know exactly who he was. A woman near the front, maybe in her 40s, stepped forward with tears already running down her face. "Mr. Higgins," she said, voice shaking. "I was 4 years old. You carried me out on your bike. I don't remember much, but my mother told me every year of my life what you did." Before Walter could answer, another man clasped his hand, then another, then a teenager who must have been the grandchild of one of the rescued kids, grinning shyly and saying, "My grandpa talks about you all the time." Walter moved through the room like a man in a dream, shaking hands, nodding, his eyes glassy and overwhelmed. Jake finally guided him to a chair set up near the center of the room, facing the crowd, and the noise settled as Jake stepped up beside him, clearing his throat. "I want to say something," Jake said, his voice carrying easy over the hush that fell across the diner. 35 years ago, I was 7 years old, and I was scared out of my mind, and a stranger on a motorcycle grabbed me out of the smoke and told me to hold on tight. I didn't know his name for 30 years. I just knew I was alive because of him. Jake's voice caught, just slightly, and he pushed through it. Walter Higgins gave me every single day I've had since that night, every birthday, every mile on the road, every single sunrise. All of it. Because of you, Pop, the room was silent, holding its breath. Walter looked up at Jake, then around at the sea of faces. All of them, alive. All of them here because of one terrible night he'd spent 35 years believing had broken him. Something in his chest cracked open, not with grief this time, but with something lighter. Something that had been buried so long he'd forgotten the shape of it. And then Walter laughed. A real laugh. Loud and full, shaking his shoulders, tears streaming down into the creases of his face. The sound of it rolling out across the crowded diner like something set free after a very long time locked away. The laughter was still fading from Walter's chest when Margaret touched his elbow. "Walter," she said softly, "can I borrow you for just a minute?" He wiped his eyes with the back of his hand, still smiling, and nodded. "Course, Margaret." She led him away from the crowd, past the counter into the small hallway near her office, where the noise of the party dropped to a muffled hum behind them. A single bulb burned overhead. Margaret's face had changed. The warmth was still there, but something else sat underneath it now, something careful and sad. "I found something," she said. "In the county archive. I wasn't sure I should show you tonight of all nights. But I didn't feel right keeping it from you either." She held up her phone. On the screen was a photograph she'd taken of an old ledger page, the paper yellowed and spotted with age. The ink faded to a brownish gray. Rows of names ran down the page in careful cursive handwriting. Margaret's thumb hovered over one line near the bottom, and she turned the phone so Walter could see. Daniel Ruiz, age 6. Unaccounted for. Walter's eyes moved over the words once, then again. His face, still flushed from laughing, went pale, the color draining out of it like water through a cracked cup. "Where did you get this?" he whispered. "The orphanage intake ledger," Margaret said. "It survived the fire. It's been sitting in a storage box in the county building for 35 years. She hesitated. "Walter, who was Daniel?" For a long moment, Walter said nothing. His hand came up and pressed flat against the wall, like he needed it to hold himself upright. The hallway light buzzed faintly overhead. Somewhere behind them, the party went on, laughter and clinking glasses. Oblivious, he was small, Walter finally said, his voice barely more than breath. Smaller than the others. 6 years old. Scared of loud noises, scared of the dark, scared of everything that night, and God, there was so much noise. The fire alarms, the screaming, the roof groaning like it was going to come down any second. He swallowed hard. The other kids ran when I told them to run. Daniel didn't. He got scared, and he hid. Supply closet, down by the kitchens. I didn't know. Nobody knew. Margaret didn't say anything. She just watched him, her own eyes filling. "I went back in," Walter said, "after I got the others out. I heard him. I heard him crying, Margaret, from behind that closet door, and I went back in after him. His hands were shaking now, worse than they had in the diner that first morning, worse than Jake had ever seen. I got close. I had my hand on the door. And then the roof came down between us. 2 of the other riders grabbed me, pulled me back, out through the flames, and I was screaming at them to let go. I was screaming his name, and they wouldn't let go. They dragged me out into the yard and held me down so I couldn't go back in." His voice cracked entirely now, the words coming out broken and small. I never heard him again after that. I always figured. I always thought. He couldn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. "I carried 11 kids out on my bike that night," Walter said. "And I told myself for 35 years it was 11 out of 12. That I failed the 12th. That boy burned in that closet because I wasn't fast enough, wasn't strong enough to get past those flames." He looked at Margaret, and his eyes were wet and hollow all at once. "And you brought me here tonight to celebrate that." "Walter, that's not—" "I need to go," he said quietly. "Walter, please just wait, let me explain, there's more to the record." But he was already moving past her, back down the hallway, his shoulders bent, his steps unsteady. He didn't go back through the diner. He slipped out the side door into the dark parking lot, past the string lights and the flowers on the lampposts, past all those people who thought they knew the whole truth of him. The night air was cool and quiet, and Walter walked out into it alone, his brown jacket buttoned to his chin, disappearing down the sidewalk toward Elm Street, leaving the warm gold light of the diner behind him. The morning came gray and quiet over Millbrook Falls. Rain had fallen sometime in the night, leaving the streets slick and shining under a sky the color of old dishwater. Inside the Sunrise Diner, Margaret flipped the sign to open at exactly 7 o'clock, same as always, and waited. 7 came and went. 7:15. 7:30. The booth by the window sat empty. No faded brown jacket. No black coffee. No dry toast going cold on a chipped plate. Margaret found herself glancing at the door every time the bell above it jangled, and every time her chest sank a little further when it wasn't him. Jake noticed, too. He'd come in that morning already uneasy, his jaw tight, his eyes flicking toward the booth every few seconds like he could will Walter into appearing there. When 8 o'clock came and went with no sign of him, Jake pushed back from the counter without finishing his coffee. "I'm going to check on him," he told Margaret. She nodded, worry creasing her forehead. "Go." Walter's house sat at the end of Elm Street, a small clapboard place with peeling white paint and a porch that sagged slightly on one side. The yard was neat but plain, no flowers, no decorations, just a walkway of cracked concrete leading up to a door the color of faded denim. Jake had never been inside. He'd never even been invited this far before. He climbed the porch steps and knocked. 3 solid raps, firm but not harsh. "Walter?" "It's Jake." Nothing. He waited a moment, then knocked again. "Walter, come on, open up." Still nothing, but this time, he heard something. A shuffle of movement behind the door. Footsteps, slow and heavy, stopping just on the other side. Walter was there. He just wasn't opening it. "I know you're in there," Jake said, gentler now. "I'm not leaving till I know you're okay." There was a long pause. Then Walter's voice came through the wood, low and rough, sounding like it had been dragged over gravel. "I'm fine, Jake. Go on home. You didn't come to the diner. I'm not hungry." Jake pressed his palm flat against the door, like he could reach through it somehow. "Walter, please, just let me in. 5 minutes. That's all I'm asking. I want to be left alone." Walter's voice cracked slightly on the last word, and Jake heard something break loose in his own chest hearing it. "Please, Jake, just leave me be." "Walter, what happened last night, none of that was your fault. You hear me? None of it. Go home, son." The word son hit Jake harder than anything else could have. It wasn't cold. It wasn't angry. It was tired. Bone tired. The kind of tired that comes from carrying something too heavy for too long. Jake stood there another full minute, his hand still pressed against the door, listening to nothing but the sound of rain dripping off the porch eaves. Finally, he stepped back. "Okay," he said quietly, more to himself than to Walter. "Okay, Pop, I'll go." He walked back to his bike parked at the curb, but he didn't start it right away. He sat there for a long moment, staring at the little blue house, feeling like something inside him had come loose and was rattling around with nowhere to land. When he walked back into the diner 20 minutes later, Margaret took one look at his face and knew. "He wouldn't see you," she said. Jake dropped onto a stool at the counter, running a hand back through his hair. He wouldn't even open the door. Just kept telling me to leave him alone. He let out a breath that shook a little on its way out. "Margaret, I think I made this worse. I think I dug up something that should have stayed buried." 35 years he had that pain locked up tight, and I came riding in here thinking I was doing something good, and all I did was rip it back open in front of the whole town. Jake, I'm serious. He looked up at her, and his eyes were red-rimmed, exhausted. Maybe the kindest thing I can do now is get on my bike and go. Give him the space he's asking for. Let him have his peace back, even if it's the same lonely peace he's had all this time. Margaret's hand came down flat on the counter, firm enough that it made him blink. "No," she said. "We are not giving up on that man. Not now. Not after everything." The county archive building sat on the corner of Main and 4th, a squat brick building with tall windows and a smell that never changed, old paper, dust, and something like forgotten time. Margaret had been coming here off and on for 2 weeks now, but this afternoon felt different. This afternoon, she had a reason to hurry. She pushed through the heavy glass doors just after 1 o'clock, her purse clutched tight against her side, the ledger copy she'd made rolled up in a tube under her arm. Behind the front desk sat Ruth Ann Dobbins, a woman in her 50s with reading glasses perched on the end of her nose, who had helped Margaret before. "Back again," Ruth Ann said, not unkindly. "I need the hospital transfer logs," Margaret said. "From 1987. Same week as the orphanage fire." Ruth Ann raised an eyebrow, but didn't argue. "Those'll be in the county medical archive, not the fire records. Different building, but I can pull the microfiche here if the county digitized it." "Give me a minute." Margaret waited, drumming her fingers on the counter, watching the clock on the wall tick past 1:15, then 1:30. Her mind kept circling back to Walter's face last night, the way it had gone pale and hollow when he saw the name Daniel Ruiz written in that old ledger. Unaccounted for, 2 words that had swallowed a man whole for 35 years. There has to be more, she told herself. There has to be something nobody found, because nobody was looking hard enough. Ruth Ann came back rolling a cart with an old microfiche reader on it, a stack of thin film sheets in her hand. "Here," she said, sliding one under the lens. "Millbrook County General, Admissions and Transfers, October 1987. This is what we've got." Margaret leaned in close, scrolling slowly through page after page of faded typewritten records. Burns, smoke inhalation. Broken bones. Name after name, most of them familiar from the orphanage ledger. She matched them one by one, her finger tracing down the list, her heart sinking a little more with each name that didn't match the one she was looking for. Then she saw it. Patient Daniel R. age approx. 6. Admitted 10/14/87. Diagnosis: 2nd and 3rd degree burns, left forearm and shoulder. Condition: stable following treatment. Margaret's breath caught in her throat. She read it again, slower this time, making sure her eyes weren't playing tricks on her. "Ruth Ann," she said, her voice tight. "Is there more? A transfer record? Anything after this?" Ruth Ann squinted at the screen over Margaret's shoulder, then flipped through her stack of sheets until she found the next one. She slid it into place. Transfer authorized 11/02/87. Patient released to County Child Services pending placement. Record sealed per court order. Margaret's hands started to shake. Sealed, she whispered. Sealed means adopted. It means he didn't die there. It means he made it out. Margaret? Ruth Ann's voice sounded far away. Margaret was already standing, already gathering the papers, her mind racing faster than her hands could keep up. 35 years Walter had believed he let a 6-year-old boy burn to death in a supply closet, and this whole time, that boy had been alive. Treated, adopted out. Living somewhere, maybe with a family, maybe with a whole life Walter never knew he'd given him. I need copies of these, Margaret said, her voice shaking with something that felt like joy and grief tangled together. Right now. Please. Ruth Ann didn't ask questions. She ran the copies while Margaret paced by the door, glancing at her watch every few seconds, willing the machine to move faster. The moment the papers were in her hands, warm from the copier, she was moving. Out the glass doors and into the gray afternoon light, half running toward her car. Her hands fumbled with the keys. She dropped them once, cursed under her breath, picked them up, and finally got the door open. She threw the papers onto the passenger seat and pulled out onto Main Street faster than she had any business driving, her heart hammering, her mind repeating the same words over and over. He's alive. Daniel is alive. Walter didn't fail. He needs to know he didn't fail. She had to find Jake. Right now. Before another hour passed. Before Walter spent one more night alone in that house believing a lie that had cost him 35 years of his life. The Sunrise Diner was empty and quiet when Margaret found Jake, the chairs already flipped up onto tables, the floor still smelling faintly of bleach from closing. He was sitting in the back booth, the one Walter never used anymore, his leather jacket draped over the seat beside him. He looked up when the bell above the door jangled. "You found something," he said. It wasn't a question. Margaret's face told him everything before she even sat down. She spread the papers across the table, smoothing out the creases with shaking hands. He didn't die, Jake. Daniel didn't die in that fire. Jake went very still. He picked up the first page, his eyes scanning the faded typewritten words. Patient Daniel R.H. approx. 6. Second and third degree burns, left forearm and shoulder. Condition, stable following treatment. Stable, Jake said quietly, like he was tasting the word, making sure it was real. He made it out. He was treated at Millbrook County General, Margaret said. Then transferred to Child Services a few weeks later. Look. She slid the second page toward him. Jake read the line twice. Record sealed per court order. His jaw tightened. Sealed. That means adopted, right? That's what that means? That's what it means. Margaret sat back, rubbing her eyes. I already called the courthouse. They said adoption records from that era, especially sealed ones, are locked up tight. We'd need a judge's order. Maybe the birth parents' consent if they're even findable. Maybe Daniel himself asking to unseal it if he's still alive. It's not like flipping through a phone book. Jake set the paper down and dragged both hands through his hair. So the trail just stops. 35 years, and now we know he lived, but we got no idea where he went. Could be anywhere. Different name, different state. Different life. I called 2 adoption registries already, Margaret said. Nothing came back. If he was adopted out of county, the paperwork could have gone through half a dozen agencies. Some of those places don't even exist anymore. They closed, merged, lost records in fires of their own, floods, you name it. She let out a long breath. It's like trying to find a single grain of sand after someone tossed the whole beach into the ocean. Jake stared down at the papers a long moment, quiet in a way that didn't suit him. Margaret had gotten used to his energy, the way he filled a room just by walking into it. Watching him sit there, shoulders sagging, made her chest ache. "We have to tell Walter," Jake finally said. "Even if we don't know where Daniel is now, he needs to know the boy lived." "That's not nothing, Margaret. That changes everything for him." "I know," she said softly. "But I keep thinking there has to be more we can do, some way to actually find him. Not just tell Walter he survived and leave it there. He deserves to see him, Jake, not just hear about him." Jake nodded slowly, and for a while, neither of them said anything. The diner sat in silence around them, the neon sign in the window buzzing faintly, the refrigerator humming from the kitchen. Margaret's eyes drifted, unfocused, toward the pass-through window that looked into the kitchen. The stainless steel counters gleamed under the dim light left on for cleaning. She wasn't really looking at anything, just letting her mind wander while it searched for answers that weren't there. Then, she stopped. Her eyes had caught on something hanging on the hook by the walk-in cooler. Carlos's apron, the one he wore every single morning, sleeves always rolled to the elbow no matter how cold it got outside. Margaret's breath caught in her throat. "Jake," she said slowly. He looked up. "What?" She didn't answer right away. Her mind was racing backward through 5 years of mornings. Carlos flipping eggs with his sleeves pushed up, the pale, puckered scar running along his left forearm that he never explained, that nobody ever asked about, because it simply seemed impolite. She thought of the time she'd asked him once, years ago, where he grew up, and he'd shrugged and said he didn't really know, that he'd been adopted young, moved around a lot, never even learned his real name. "Jake," she said again, quieter this time, her voice trembling. "Carlos has a scar. On his arm. Left forearm. He's had it as long as I've known him." Jake's eyes went wide. "Margaret, what are you saying?" She turned to look at him, her hand pressed flat against her chest like she could hold her own heart still. "I'm saying I don't think we need to look anywhere else." The next morning, the sun hadn't even cleared the ridge behind Millbrook Falls when Margaret unlocked the diner's front door. The lights were still off inside, the chairs still resting upside down on the tables. She flipped the sign to closed, even though it was already closed, just to be sure nobody wandered in. Jake was already there, leaning against his motorcycle out front, his face pale under the gray morning light. He hadn't slept. She could tell by the way he moved, slow and careful, like a man carrying something heavy he was afraid to drop. "You ready?" Margaret asked. "No," Jake said. "But let's do it anyway." They walked in together. The kitchen light was already on, a soft yellow glow spilling through the pass-through window. Carlos was there, like always, chopping onions on the steel counter, his sleeves rolled to the elbow, the old pale scar catching the light along his forearm. He looked up when he heard them come in. "You're here early," he said, wiping his hands on his apron. "Coffee's not even on yet." "That's all right," Margaret said. Her voice came out softer than she meant it to. "We just wanted to talk to you, before the morning gets busy." Carlos set down his knife. Something in her tone must have caught him, because his easy smile faded a little. "Everything okay?" "We hope so," Jake said. He pulled out one of the kitchen stools and sat down across from him, the way he always sat across from Walter. Careful, steady, like he didn't want to spook him, Margaret leaned against the counter, her hands twisting together. "Carlos, can I ask you something? About your arm?" Carlos glanced down at the scar like he'd forgotten it was even there. He touched it lightly, almost without thinking. "This old thing? I've had it since I was a kid. Never knew exactly how I got it. Doctors said probably a fire, maybe a stove, something like that. I don't really remember. Do you remember anything?" Jake asked. His voice was quiet, careful from before, when you were real little. Carlos was quiet for a moment. He picked his knife back up, then set it down again, like his hands needed something to do but his mind wasn't in it anymore. "Not much," he said. "Just pieces. You know how it is when you're that young. Things don't really stick." "What kind of pieces?" Margaret asked gently. Carlos looked between them, his brow furrowing like he was trying to figure out why they were asking, what this was really about. But something in their faces must have told him it mattered, because he didn't brush it off. "There's smoke," he said slowly. "I remember smoke, and noise. A lot of noise, like people shouting. And..." He stopped, his jaw tightening like the memory itself hurt to hold on to. "Motorcycles. I remember the sound of motorcycles. Real loud, real close. I used to think I made it up. Like a dream that got stuck in my head." Jake's hands, resting on the counter, had begun to shake. He pressed them flat against the steel to stop it, but it didn't work. "I moved here 5 years ago," Carlos went on, quieter now, like he was pulling the words up from somewhere deep. "I didn't have family. Not really. Bounced around foster homes most of my life after I got adopted, and that didn't work out either. But I kept having this feeling, like I needed to come here. Millbrook Falls. I couldn't tell you why. I just knew it was supposed to mean something, so I came. Took the first job I could find." He shrugged, but his eyes were far away now, caught somewhere in the past. "Never figured out why. Guess I just liked the quiet." Jake couldn't speak. He stared at Carlos like he was looking at a ghost, his throat working but no sound coming out. Margaret reached over and put her hand gently on Carlos's arm right above the scar. Her eyes were wet. "Carlos," she said softly, "we need to show you something. Will you come with us?" Carlos untied his apron and set it on the counter, slow, like his hands needed the extra second to catch up with what was happening. He followed them to the small back office where Margaret did her books, a cramped room with a metal desk and a filing cabinet that stuck if you didn't jiggle the handle just right. Margaret pulled out the yellowed newspaper clipping first. She'd looked at it so many times over the years that the creases had gone soft, almost like cloth. She laid it flat on the desk. "This is from 1987, she said. "There was a fire. An orphanage, up on the county road past the ridge. It burned fast, faster than anybody expected, and the fire trucks couldn't get up the mountain in time because the road was blocked." Carlos leaned over the clipping. The photo was grainy, black and white, showing a line of motorcycles parked outside a smoking building. You couldn't make out any faces. "A group of bikers went in instead," Jake said. His voice was steady now, though his hands weren't. "They rode kids out on the backs of their bikes. 11 of them made it out that night. I was one of them, Jake said. 7 years old. I don't remember most of it. But I remember a hand on the back of my neck, pulling me onto a bike, and a voice telling me to hold on and not let go. Margaret slid the second piece of paper across the desk. It was a photocopy, the ledger page from the county archive, names written in careful faded pen. She pointed to a line near the bottom. This is the intake list from the orphanage, she said. Every kid who lived there that year. And this name here. Her finger stopped on a row. Daniel Ruiz. Age 6. Marked unaccounted for after the fire. Carlos stared at the name. His face had gone very still. The kind of still that isn't calm. Just frozen. For 35 years, Jake said, the man who ran into that building thinking he lost you has believed you died in there. He carried it every single day since. He stopped talking to people. Stopped living, really just going through the motions. Alone. Because he thought he failed to save one kid. There's more, Margaret said gently. She pulled out the last paper, the one she'd found buried in the hospital transfer records, brittle and stamped with an old county seal. A burn-injured child, initials DR, treated the same week as the fire. Transferred out of county. Record sealed after adoption. She looked up at Carlos. We think that was you. The room went quiet, except for the hum of the old refrigerator out in the kitchen. Carlos hadn't moved. His eyes were fixed on the ledger, on that one line with his name on it, like it might change if he looked away and looked back. I don't remember a name, he said finally, his voice rough. Nobody ever told me anything, just that I was adopted young. Burn scar from a fire, that's all the paperwork ever said. Jake reached over, not touching him, just resting his hand near Carlos's on the desk. Can I see your arm again? Carlos rolled up his sleeve without a word. The old scar ran pale and puckered from his wrist to his elbow, the skin slightly shiny where it had healed wrong all those years ago. Margaret pulled the hospital paper closer and read the description out loud, the location, the depth, the pattern of the burn. It matched, line for line. Carlos's breathing had gone shallow. He kept looking at his own arm like it belonged to somebody else. He thought he lost you, Jake said quietly. He spent 35 years thinking that, and you've been standing 10 feet away from him every single morning, pouring his coffee. Carlos closed his eyes. When he opened them again, they were wet, and his jaw was tight, working hard to hold something back. I need to see him, he said. Now, not tomorrow. Not after my shift. Now, Jake was already reaching for his keys, his chair scraping back hard against the floor. Margaret grabbed her coat off the hook by the door and flipped the sign from closed to closed, for real this time, and pulled the front door shut behind them, the lock clicking into place as the three of them headed for the truck. The truck rattled up the gravel drive, just as the sun dropped behind the ridge, painting the sky in streaks of orange and purple that faded to gray at the edges. Walter's house sat small and quiet at the end of the road, a single porch light glowing weak against the coming dark. The paint on the shutters had peeled long ago and never been redone. A wind chime hung motionless by the door, like even the air knew to be still here. Jake parked and cut the engine. For a moment, nobody moved. Carlos sat in the back seat, his hands pressed flat against his knees, staring at the house like it might vanish if he blinked. You don't have to do this tonight, Margaret said softly, turning in her seat. We could wait until morning. Let him rest. Carlos shook his head. I've waited my whole life without knowing what I was waiting for. I'm not waiting one more night." They climbed out. The gravel crunched under their boots, loud in the quiet evening. Jake led the way up the porch steps, the old wood groaning under his weight. He raised his hand and knocked, 3 slow, solid knocks that echoed through the still air. Nothing happened for a long moment. Then another. Margaret glanced at Jake, worry creasing her face. Jake knocked again, softer this time. "Pop," he called. "It's me, it's Jake." Finally, they heard it, the shuffle of slow feet, the scrape of a chair being pushed back somewhere inside. A lock clicked. The door opened slow, hesitant, like Walter wasn't sure he wanted to see who was on the other side. He looked worse than he had that morning at the diner. His face was gaunt, hollowed out, like the last few days had aged him another 10 years. His eyes were red-rimmed, his jacket hanging open and forgotten over a wrinkled undershirt. He gripped the doorframe like it was the only thing holding him up. His eyes moved from Jake to Margaret, and then landed on Carlos. He froze. "What?" Walter started, his voice a dry rasp. "What is this?" Nobody answered right away. Carlos stepped forward, past Jake, past Margaret, until he stood right at the bottom of the porch steps, looking up at the old man who had haunted a name he never understood. Walter's hands began to tremble against the doorframe, the same shake Jake had steadied that first morning in the diner. Carlos reached down and rolled up his sleeve, slow, deliberate, the fabric bunching at his elbow. The porch light caught the old scar, pale and puckered, running from his wrist up toward his forearm. Walter's breath caught. He stared at the scar like he was looking at a ghost, like his eyes couldn't quite believe what they were seeing, and needed to look twice, 3 times, to trust it. "Someone told me to hide," Carlos said, his voice cracking halfway through the sentence, "and someone came back for me." The words hit the porch like a struck bell. Walter's face crumpled. His mouth opened, but no sound came out at first, just a broken breath, a sound like something tearing loose after being held too tight for too long. "Daniel," he whispered. The name came out cracked, disbelieving, like he was afraid saying it too loud might make it not true. His knees gave out. He didn't fall so much as sink, his hand sliding down the doorframe as his legs folded beneath him. Right there on the porch, the old man collapsing to his knees in the doorway of his own home. Carlos rushed forward and dropped down in front of him, catching him, holding him up by the shoulders. Walter's hands, still shaking, reached up and gripped Carlos's arms like he needed to feel it was real, that the man kneeling in front of him wasn't some trick of grief and exhaustion. "I thought," Walter choked out, "I thought I left you in there. 35 years, I thought." "I know," Carlos whispered, his own voice breaking now too. "I know. I'm here." Walter's hands moved from Carlos's arms to his back, pulling him in, and Carlos let himself be pulled. The two of them wrapped around each other in the doorway, Walter sobbing openly now. Decades of silence breaking apart all at once. Margaret pressed a hand over her mouth, tears sliding down her face. Jake stood behind her, his jaw tight, his eyes shining in the porch light, watching the two men hold on to each other like neither one intended to ever let go again. The days after that night on the porch moved different than any days Walter could remember. He woke each morning still tired, still carrying the weight of 35 years. But now, there was something else sitting next to that weight, something lighter. He didn't have a word for it yet, but it felt a little bit like hope. Word of what happened traveled through Millbrook Falls the way water finds every crack in the ground. By Tuesday, half the town knew that Carlos, the quiet cook who'd flipped their eggs for 5 years, was the boy Walter had spent a lifetime grieving. By Wednesday, the other half knew too. Margaret called a meeting at the diner before the doors opened, all the regulars packed into booths, coffee going cold in their hands because nobody wanted to be the one drinking while something important was happening. "I've been running this diner for 22 years, Margaret said, standing near the counter with her arms crossed and her eyes wet. "And I never once knew I was standing on top of the biggest story this town ever had. Well, I'm not gonna sit on it anymore." She reached under the counter and pulled out a piece of poster board, the kind kids used for school projects, with words painted in careful blue letters. "Higgins Table, we're renaming the diner," she said. "After Walter, and we're putting that phoenix, the one on his neck and on Jake's arm, right there on the front window for every single person who walks by to see." Nobody argued. A few people cried. Old Mr. Denny, who'd been coming in every Sunday for 15 years and never said 2 words to Walter, stood up and clapped. And then, everyone was clapping, and Margaret had to wipe her eyes with her apron before she could keep talking about the details. They planned it for Saturday. Jake called every rider he could track down, the grown children who'd once been carried out of a burning building on the backs of motorcycles. Carlos helped Margaret dig through old boxes for photographs. A local sign painter, a woman named Rosa who owed Margaret a favor from years back, agreed to paint the new window herself, staying up 2 nights straight to get the phoenix just right, its wings stretched wide over a motorcycle wheel, exactly like the one on Walter's neck. By Saturday morning, the diner could not have fit one more person if it tried. Cars lined the street outside, parked crooked in the gravel lot and along both curbs. Inside, every booth was full, every stool at the counter taken, and people stood shoulder to shoulder along the walls, spilling out onto the sidewalk where Rosa had covered the window with a long sheet of brown paper, hiding the new sign underneath. Walter sat at his usual booth, but it didn't feel usual anymore. His jacket hung open. Carlos stood at his side instead of behind the kitchen counter, an apron still tied around his waist out of habit, his hand resting on the old man's shoulder like it belonged there. Jake stood near the door with a handful of the grown riders, men and women now with families of their own, all of them wearing the same worn, grateful look on their faces. Margaret climbed up on a chair near the window, her hand gripping a corner of the brown paper. "Walter," she called out over the crowd. "Would you like to do the honors?" Walter's hand still shook a little, always would, but Carlos steadied him as he stood, and together they walked to the window. The whole diner went quiet, waiting. Walter reached up and pulled the paper down in one long tear. The phoenix caught the morning sun, its wings painted gold and orange, wrapped tight around a motorcycle wheel, and beneath it in bold black letters, "Higgins Table." The diner erupted. Clapping, whistling, someone in the back crying loud enough that everyone could hear it, and Walter stood there staring at his own name on the glass, like he still didn't quite believe any of it was real. Near the counter, Tyler leaned toward a stranger who'd wandered in that morning, a young man passing through town who'd stopped for coffee and found himself in the middle of something much bigger. "See that old man there?" Tyler said, pointing toward Walter with something like pride swelling in his voice. "Let me tell you what he did back in 1987. Weeks passed, and Millbrook Falls settled into something new. The town had a different shape to it now, like furniture moved just slightly to let more light in. Every morning at 7, the bell above the door of Higgins's table jangled, and Walter walked in with his jacket unbuttoned, swinging loose at his sides. His shoulders sat different too, not hunched up around his ears the way they used to be, but easy, like a man who'd set down something heavy he'd been carrying a long time. "Morning, Walter." Someone would call from a booth, and Walter would nod, sometimes even lift a hand in a small wave. He was learning how to be seen again. It didn't come easy, not after 35 years of trying to disappear, but he was learning. He took his usual booth, the one by the window with the new phoenix painted on the glass behind him, wings stretched wide and gold in the morning sun. But it wasn't a lonely booth anymore. Jake slid in across from him most days before Walter even had his coffee poured, leather jacket creaking against the vinyl seat, and Carlos came out from the kitchen with a plate of eggs he didn't even need to ask about anymore, because he already knew exactly how Walter liked them. "You're getting slow back there," Jake said one morning, nodding toward the kitchen. "Old man's coffee's cold." "Old man can wait 30 seconds, Carlos said, setting the plate down anyway, a small smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. It was a smile that came easier now too, same as Walter's did. Margaret kept the diner running same as always, but she made time now, every single morning, to lean against the counter near Walter's booth and listen to whatever stories Jake managed to pull out of him. Some mornings Walter talked about the fire, small pieces at a time, the smell of smoke and the sound of engines roaring up the mountain road. Other mornings he talked about nothing important at all, just the weather, or a bird he'd seen on his porch, and those mornings were good too, maybe even better, because they were just Walter being a man who got to have ordinary days. Word had gotten around further than Millbrook Falls by then. A few of the grown writers' children drove in from out of state some weekends, bringing their own kids along. Little ones who didn't understand exactly what had happened all those years ago, but understood enough to know that the old man in the booth by the window was somebody special. They'd climb up next to him, and Walter would let them, patient in a way he'd never really had the chance to be patient before. On a Saturday morning in late autumn, the diner was full again, not with the shocked crowd from the renaming, but with the easy fullness of a place that had become the heart of the town. Sunlight came through the phoenix on the window and threw colored light across the floor. Tyler wove between tables refilling coffee cups, and more than once a stranger passing through Millbrook Falls got an earful about the old man in the corner booth before they even had a chance to order. Jake sat across from Walter, same as always, and Carlos had pulled a chair up to the end of the table, apron still tied at his waist. Margaret leaned against the booth's edge with her arms crossed, laughing at something Jake had just said. Two of the grown riders, a woman named Denise and her brother Paul, had come in with their families, squeezing into the booth behind Walter's, close enough to be part of the conversation. Someone told a story, an old one, about the time Walter had tried to teach a scared 7-year-old Jake how to ride a bicycle instead of a motorcycle, and how Jake had crashed straight into a fence and come up laughing anyway. Walter listened, and something in his chest loosened, and before he even realized it was happening, he was laughing too. Really laughing, the kind that shook his shoulders and crinkled the corners of his eyes, the kind he hadn't let himself do in 35 years. Around him sat the family the fire had once tried to take away. Jake, who never stopped looking. Margaret, who never stopped digging. Carlos, who had been there all along without either of them knowing it, and all the others, children grown into adults, alive because one silent man had refused to leave anybody behind. Some heroes wait a lifetime not for applause, but for the chance to know their sacrifice was never in vain. I hope you like this story. Please share what's your favorite part of the story and where in the world you are watching from. Have a wonderful day.